All right, folks, I think we're going to go and get started. And I wanted to share a brief anecdote of sorts from my own flying, which you might find interesting. A round of applause for when we get started. Come on now. So, I was flying Sweet Red in 2013, 2012 actually, and it was, by the time I'd done a number of very nice flights. And it was a thermal day, and I was landing out at a place called Cherry Valley. It was still an airport back then. And as I was getting lower and lower and lower, it was pretty clear to me I'm gonna probably have to land out. But as I was getting lower, I figured, well, I might as well test the ridge. The wind was about 5-7 knots out of northwest. Maybe I'll pick up a thermal. And so as I was slowing down, and I'm slowing down and slowing down, sort of looking at the, getting closer and closer to the ridge, and I see an eagle going and circling over a gully. I said, man, that's great. There's a thermal right there. That bubble will pick me up and get me away. And right as I start easing into the turn, I realized the glider started shuddering on me. And I was really surprised, and I still very distinctly see this image in my mind, where as I turn in, right at that moment, my eyes kind of pop out, and I sort of look at my situation. I realize I'm going 30, have about 25-degree bank, and my yaw string is angled into the turn. And now, at that point, I unloaded the glider, I dropped the nose a little bit, the eagle thermaled away, and I landed at Cherry Valley. But one of the things I realized is that I was damn near close to going to a spin, and a 126 will spin on you just like anything else would. And I was very fortunate to be flying a 126 that day, unlike perhaps a higher performing glider. And so, we're going to be talking a lot about the basics and the techniques and how to look at the conditions and assess things. And we were discussing this at length with Erik and such. And Erik really wanted to talk about the fundamentals, what go into the underlying variables and such. And Erik, he really is kind of our, he's our refinishing weather and ridge guru in pretty much every respect in our club. And he's done all sorts of wonderful flights. He's, you won the Barrett Hilton Cup one of the years, right? And flown all sorts of contests, and he really is kind of one of our club elders, and we're really lucky to have him here today. And I'm very fortunate. I was very fortunate actually to do my rich cross country training with him in his grove. He was very generous with his time, and was one of the people that really coached me into the flying that I do.
So, what do you want from me?
So, well, let's give a round of applause for Erik.
Normally, first off, I'm not as old as I look. I actually started soaring relatively young in this world. I was 18, I think, and I've been at it for whatever it is now, 30-something years. So, normally when my kids want something, that's usually when they butter me up with stuff like that. Thanks, Daniel. So I am going to, first off, how many of you in the room do public speaking, a fair amount of speaking? How many of you are, okay, so a fair amount of you, right? What is the single worst time slot to have in a public speaking? Right? After lunch, right?
That's your joke? Right before lunch or 2 after.
Well, or right before the bar opens. The second problem is when you follow a double PhD and a multi-time national champion and world team member, right? So really, this can only go badly. So what I want to do is, first off, since it's after lunch, little team participation. Everybody stand up, please. Chris, you can stay seated. Chris says go screw yourself. Okay, so just so we kind of know what we're dealing with here, if you have not gotten your private rating yet, just take a seat, just so I kind of know what we got. Again, no, nothing, but you'll see, guys. This is going to take a little while. Okay, if you have not done a glider cross country up to your silver distance, in other words, You've got your rating, but you haven't got a silver distance. Grab a seat. Okay, so that gives you a sense. So,
Say or equivalent.
no, hang on, or equivalent.
Yeah.
So again, guys, what I'm trying to do is tune the conversation so that I can hit various levels, right? We're going to try to accommodate everybody here. If you've got your gold distance, if you've got your silver but you haven't done a gold yet, go ahead and sit down. Okay. So now we got a much smaller group here. So these are the folks. The last two groups are probably the folks that are most interested in the more advanced ridge topics, right? Because you're the ones that are trying to make those first long flights. Okay, if you haven't done your diamond, your 500K, grab a seat. Okay, so we still got a few pretty experienced people. Okay, anything?
Can we go to sleep?
Less, you can go to sleep, Tim. Less than not a 750. So up to 750s stay standing. Everybody else, okay. So there's a few 750s. Thousands. Anybody that doesn't have 1,000. All right. So you guys can go to sleep. All right. 1,200. All right, so only that. Okay, so you guys can look around. It's a wide range of audiences here. I'm going to try to hopefully give something useful for most of you. Bobby's hopeless. I can't help Bobby. Oh, did we lose the projector?
We lost the projector.
Okay.
Have that right on your mouth.
This is the. Oh no, I think the amp got unplugged too. This is the amp one. I'm usually not accused of lacking projection. So.
Just in case they're recording.
Yes. There's a special place in hell for those two. All right. While these guys are fiddling with, I see power coming back.
There we are. Don't touch.
Okay, nobody move. Can you guys hear me if I don't use the? Okay. I'll just.
Are they using that for recording now?
No, the recording is here.
Okay.
Okay, now this thing's back. I may end up putting it down anyway because it's kind of awkward what I wanted to be doing. So, whoops. All right, everything's back. Sorry, guys. Okay. So I think this section is really sort of a little bit of back to basics. My focus is going to be kind of building on what Carl was talking about and what Richard was talking about. How do you avoid doing the really stupid things that get people in trouble? All right. So really, you should be looking at this as not how do I do these amazing 1,000K flights, but how do I not kill myself in the process of getting there? Unfortunately, I've got this beautiful cover photo. This is coming up from Jack's Mountain at Mill Creek. Gorgeous view in the distance, 6,000 feet. Trust me, it's spectacular. It's actually IMC. I think I flew, I didn't take Richard's advice. At night. Right? Single pilot night IMC in a glider is probably one of the most dangerous types of flying you'll ever do.
What?
Okay, how many of you have seen this book? Okay, good. So that's actually really good. Most of what I'm going to cover is contained in the first 40 pages of this book. Hopefully I maybe tell it a little bit differently. Cookie?
You're blocking.
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. You know what? I'm going to do away with this.
Yeah.
I always walk when I talk to people anyway, so. Yeah, highly recommend you get this book. It's still available, as far as I know, from Tom Knopf directly and also from Amazon. Really good. Hand-drawn maps by George Vacker. Lots of interesting information and a lot of information that could save your life. Okay, now not to start the afternoon on a downer, but this is an eye test for you in the back, but I'll summarize it. The stuff that we do is probably some of the most dangerous flying you'll ever do in any type of aviation. I'm sure Carl has stories in gliding that were scarier than flying an F-104 and whatever you flew, all kinds of interesting airplanes. Biff Huss, who some of you know, has probably 100 night traps on an aircraft carrier flying, what did he fly? F-14s, I think. Yeah. He says that some of the ridge soaring he's done has been some of the scariest flying he's ever done. And this is a guy that flew inverted through passes in NAS Fallon and was in the aggressor squadron there. So it can be some of the most exciting and best flying and actually fairly safe flying. And as Richard pointed out earlier, it's up to us to manage risk. So nobody says that you have to be, like Carl was saying, nobody says you have to be down on the trees. Nobody says you have to fly 1,000 K every time you go out. And you heard both of them earlier talk about realizing it wasn't working and giving up and going back. And if nothing else comes out of this session, hopefully I can help you kind of set your own personal limits to say, hey, when am I in over my head and when is enough enough? So what this has on it is I went to the NTSB database, which is only reported accidents. I'm sure there's a couple that may slip through the cracks. And this is only Pennsylvania. So I know Dale Kramer's crash isn't in here. I know one day at Newcastle, I think we put, what, 3 in the trees on the same day? Right. So this is probably a small subset of all the accidents that happened in the Appalachians in the last 20 years. I know of at least 3 in New Jersey that aren't on here. So let's assume that if you take everybody in this room who could have been flying in the Appalachians during this period, this list is double. So roughly one a year is a total with an injury. And at least once a decade, somebody kills themselves in the ridges. 2 fatals, 5 serious accidents. Most of them, the majority of the accidents, are some combination of stall, spin related. Either running out of airspeed and air at the same time, or trying to do something to get off of a ridge and having it not work out. And I'm going to dig deeper into what both Carl and Richard talked about earlier. So the only takeaway from here is this is serious stuff. And it's not unmanageable. In fact, it's extremely manageable. I think everybody on this list that crashed, for the most part, was aware of what they were doing. A couple of these pilots on here were super experienced ridge pilots. In fact, the one accident here, whoops, didn't want to do that yet. Sorry. This one here, Brian did what, 1,200 K the day before? Yeah. Week before. Right? So the same guy that just flew one of the best flights that's been done in the ridge systems a week later on a pretty routine ridge mission ended up crashing into the mountains. Okay? It's incredibly unforgiving.
Erik, what's dog bone?
Yeah, what's dog?
We're coming to dog bone. Figure eights, or as the Brits would say, figures of 8. We're gonna cover all this stuff. So this was just to get everybody in a really depressed mood after lunch. That's all this is.
There you go. You set the clock.
Hopefully the message is there. It's incredibly fun, it's incredibly rewarding, but it's not something that you should be playing around with. Sorry guys, I've got the wrong button. Okay. Carl covered this, Richard covered this. I'm not going to go into it much more, but basically you need wind blowing against a mountain, and that wind should be blowing at a pretty good speed and a pretty good angle, and the air's got to go up. I'm hoping everybody here kind of has that part. If you don't have that part, maybe I need to take a big step back. As Carl mentioned earlier, depending on the shape of the ridge, the vertical component of the lift can be more or less. And we're going to get into all that stuff earlier. And again, we're going to show where to fly, whatever. But there's a couple takeaways from this, right? As Carl said, the best lift is always somewhere out in front. We're going to come back to that. We don't want to be here, and we certainly don't want to be over here. So far, so good? Okay. So we talked about direction earlier with Richard. I'm trying to give people kind of a rule of thumb, and Carl pointed this out earlier. There's no absolutes in ridge soaring, because the ridges themselves are variable, the winds move around a little bit. What I'm trying to say is, if you're planning your first ridge flight, okay, or you're planning your first long ridge mission, if it doesn't fall, if the overall winds don't kind of fall within plus or minus 30 degrees of the part of the ridge system that you're planning to fly on, you shouldn't be there. Now, you can go fly the local ridge. In fact, I highly encourage people to fly on some marginal days near their local ridges if it's a ridge that has a good landing field out in front of it, like Jack's Mountain, like flying locally at ridge soaring, places where there's safe fields and good ridges. You can experiment with that stuff, but you should be doing that fully aware that any time that the wind is not, as close to perpendicular as possible, you're starting to get toward the edges. Now, there's not one hard number. If the winds are weak, or the ridge is in a little bit of a kink or whatever, maybe 30 degrees off is not good enough because that local spot that you're flying in actually isn't 30 degrees, it's more like 45 degrees. But by and large, and I'm going to give you guys a whole chart later, but by and large, if you're flying out of Blairstown and you see 330, 320, 340 on the forecast, you're a happy camper. If you see 310, you're still pretty happy. When you start to see 300, 290, you should be starting to worry, and if you start seeing something like 280 or the higher numbers in the other direction, now you're starting to get toward these areas here. But again, I'm not talking about Carl or Schwartz or Daniel setting records where they may have to fly through some bad areas. I'm talking about the person that's trying to do their first 300K out and return on the ridge or their first 500. So step one is you should be aiming for, you know, good wind direction for the section that you're flying. We're going to cover that in a minute. No disconnects here, right? Everybody good? And by the way, stop me, you know, as I go.
So it seems like 30 is the magic number. 30 knots, 30.
Nope, coming back to speed in a second. 30, okay, so again, actually, it's good that you said that. So, I'm going to sound like I'm a consultant. I'm a management consultant by background. So, you know, never, ever, ever ask a management consultant for a straight answer because we're going to tell you that it depends. It depends. But I would say on the average wind speed in an average day on a normal ridge, if you've got 30 degrees plus or minus from perpendicular, that's good. If it starts getting past that, it's worse. Obviously, perpendicular is best, and anything less than perpendicular is less good.
And always look 30 years old in life.
Okay. Whoops, sorry, Daniel, I got the wrong button. So the second thing is speed. Now, I'm going to give you my personal limits, but basically, somewhere around 20 knots at ridge top is a wonderful speed. It's not perfect. It could be, it could go down, and again, it depends. Is real. Oh, guys, I'm sorry. But if you see 20 at ridge top, that's probably about as good as it's going to get. 18, wonderful. 22, pretty good. The weaker it gets, the slower, 15 knots can work really well, especially sometimes in the spring. It works fantastically on the back side of some ridges, which are better shaped, and we're going to come to that. Again, there's no absolutes. But what I would say is when I see a ridge forecast of 18 to 22, 23 at Ridgecrest, Tony Benson used to have a saying called Gentleman's Ridge. Gentleman's Ridge is probably around here. Really good honkin' ridge is somewhere in here. But again, there's no one absolute. But what I'm saying is the people in this room, for most of the people that were not standing at the end, your ideal day should be somewhere in here. Again, could it work at 12? Yeah, I've flown the ridge at 12 knots, especially on the backside. It can be magical, especially late at night or early in the morning when there's not thermals to disrupt it. Can 18 knots be not quite enough? Yeah, if the angle is bad or you're flying in a bad section of ridge. But by and large, if you're seeing these kind of winds, probably pretty good. Now, you heard the Dale Kramer story. Once the winds start to get above 30 knots at the ridge top, not only is it rough as hell, but imagine what has to happen to get off the ridge and make transitions, right? And typically, if it's 30 knots at ridge top, it's 50 knots at cloud base. Now, I don't know how many of you have flown routinely thermal flights when the winds are blowing 50. Fun is not the word that comes to mind, right? Now we're not. So again, this is not a record. This is not the record. We're not in the record camp, right? If you're going for world records and you're at the level of the people that were still standing when we were at the 750s, you'll make your risk judgments. But if you're the person trying for your 500 or your 300 on the ridge, I would be really anxious if I start seeing, especially to the right of this. I'd be saying, wait a minute. And Richard's talk was what was it? Run or walk away. Was it walk away? Run or walk away. This is starting to get to walk away. Damn.
I just want to also note that more is not better. That
Right.
Once it gets above 25 knots, the ridge doesn't work any better.
Right.
It
It just gets rougher. Yeah, you can't fly the glider fast enough to take advantage of 30-knot winds. Yeah.
It's worth pointing out that the stronger the wind, the more the crab, so you're
Yes.
actually not
Yes.
gaining.
Yeah. Richard pointed out that the aerodynamics of it are such that the crab angle that you're maintaining is actually greater when the winds are that high, that you're actually not necessarily making any faster ground speed. point being, for all of us in this room that are thinking about it, you're aiming for the sweet spot. That's really it. And again, the danger and the risk management is much higher here, and especially here. You're pushing the limits. Okay. So far, so good? Okay. So how does it all look, kind of practically speaking? And Carl touched on this earlier, and I'll touch on it. There's sort of this general sweet spot that's kind of at an angle out from the ridge. And again, there's no hard and fast number. It can be a little further out. It might be a little closer to here, depending on the shape of the ridge, the strength of the wind, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, if you're down here and flying fast, you saw that picture that Carl had. You're going to be looking, this glider's flying away from us. You're going to be looking at your canopy rail on the right, and you're going to be kind of looking at the local ridge crest right there. But nobody says you have to fly down there. You can fly right up here. Slower, steadier. Again, gentleman's ridge or gentle ladies ridge. That's another way to do it. But the point is, there's a sweet spot for every speed that you want to fly. And generally speaking, you can decide how fast you want to go depending on how high you want to be. It's basically a trade-off. So, here's a couple of options. And Carl talked about this earlier. Record day, trying to make 1,000. You gotta, daylight is burning. You only have 10 hours to fly. You gotta be moving at the speed of heat. You're gonna be down here. Maybe 100 feet, 50 feet off the ridge, 100 knots or more. Okay? Your wings are gonna be flexing. Your apple's gonna be bobbing up and down in the cockpit. Hopefully you've got everything strapped down, including yourself. You're gonna be cooking. Okay? First flight, you've got 6 hours to do a 500K. You've got 5.5, 6 hours to do it. You can fly up here. 70 might be a little bit slow, but 80 knots up high, and by high I mean 500, 600, 1,000 feet above the ridge. You're still making great speed. You're not turning, okay? You're not getting the living daylight speed out of you. And you have a little bit more time to kind of react. Now, this is on a really good day. Some days, you can't even get close to it. You can't even get to 100 feet from the ridge, right? Some days the ridge doesn't work up high either. So again, there's not a golden one-size-fits-all, and that's kind of the big thing about ridge soaring. But again, I'm saying on the day that you're likely to be flying, especially you're flying your first task, you're probably going to want to be flying somewhere in between here. And again, if you're learning on the local ridge and you want to try it and you've got great fields out in front, maybe you're with your instructor for the first time, you know, go stick a wing in the trees and go fast. You want to then experiment, slow up, and see how high you can go and still be in ridge lift. I don't know, Carl, what do you think is the highest you can go in ridge lift and still be in ridge lift? 1,000 feet? Yeah. So a lot of our ridges around here are 2,000 to 2,500 MSL, 3,000. So you could be at 3,500 feet MSL, cooking along at 70 knots, still using ridge lift, and having a wonderful time of it, and still be going long distances without turning, right? So the point is, you don't have to be down here scaring the squirrels. You can be up here. Now, I think Carl talked about this, and I'm going to absolutely, so what are the warning signs, right? The warning signs are, let me just do it. Here we go. The warning signs are 100 knots and 100 feet over the trees, you're cooking, right? And Carl talked about this. At 100 knots, if you pull up, you're going to instantly gain 300, 400 feet, right? So if you happen to see a gap or you've got a bad area coming up, or you're going to use that energy and just gradually bleed it off as you go across, you've got lots of energy, right? Kinetic energy, potential energy, total energy, for any of you engineering and physics types. Problem is, when you get down here and you haven't been paying attention, and all of a sudden you've been flying along at 100 knots, and then you were flying at 90 knots, and then you were flying at 80 knots, and then you were flying at 70 knots, right? Something's been happening. Either the wind has been weakening, or you've been flying into an area where the wind, the ridge has turned, or the direction has changed. Something has been happening. When you find yourself down here, you're in bad shape, right? And Richard talked about this earlier. There's not a lot of energy left in the system for you to take evasive action or to float through a gap, or even sometimes to pull away and do something else, right? So you better be looking for that thermal or that first pulse where you can waft up, and again, we're going to cover that later. But the bigger point is, there's only 2 instruments you need in the glider. Well, it's 3. You need your eyes, but your airspeed and your altimeter tell you everything you need to know. You could have a fancy glide computer. I must have 7 different wind directions in the cockpit. I've got Netto, I've got Super Netto, I've got Super Cruise Netto, I've got Netto for Netto. And they're all great, but if every one of those crapped out, as long as I've got an altimeter that's still working, even if I don't, as long as my eyes are still working and I've got an airspeed indicator, I should be able to tell how the ridge is working. Make sense? Okay. Have I lost anybody? Anybody asleep yet? Bill's trying. No, you're still there? Okay. All right. So no dissonance there. So ass and eyeballs, right? And I know if you fly with people like Carl, or you fly with people like John Seymour, one of the amazing things after every flight is the debrief is going to be, did you see that Golden Eagle at Altoona Gap? Or did you notice the guy plowing his field over by Man's Choice? Or did you happen to see the sharp shin on Tussie? Or that pair of squirrels that was running up the tree underneath those acorns? The reason is they're looking out the damn window, right? They're paying attention to all that information that comes from the most analog instruments that you have, okay? And I know a lot of people, I'll tell the story in a minute, a lot of people get hung up on the latest widgets and gadgets and gadgets. Ridge soaring is about as simple as it gets. As long as you're flying on a stretch of ridge that's reasonably straight and constant, whatever airspeed you're achieving is telling you whether it's getting better or worse, right? So combination of altitude and airspeed is all you need to know. But there's all these other things, right? The crab angle that you're holding tells you how much crosswind component there is onto the ridge. If you've been flying along like this, and all of a sudden you find you're flying like this on the same ridge, right, and your crab angle is decreasing, maybe it's not so good anymore, right? You've been flying, I'm sort of the ridge. You've had this really extreme crab angle for all day, and as you've been going along later and later, you're finding yourself doing this, and probably at the same time doing this to slow up. It's not as good as it was when you started earlier, right? Okay. Smoke. There are lots of places, not just forest fires and things. There's lots of little factories in the ridge system. There's one by the town of Pillow on Montango Mountain. I think it's a cheese factory or something. It seems to have I think it maybe is steam, not smoke. It's always working. They have a big orange windsock next to it too. I think factories are supposed to have that for disbursement if something bad happens. Anyway, you're flying along, you see that smoke trail coming straight at the ridge, right? You're pretty happy. Cloud shadows, not always as reliable because the cloud shadows are coming from the clouds up high, but on most days, if you see the shadows of the clouds marching along pretty much perpendicular to the ridge, at least you know the macro picture, the winds are still coming out of the northwest. Now, as you get lower, sometimes the winds back or veer, so it's not 100% reliable, but it's a great way to gather information. You hear Carl talking about this all the time. I forget, what's the word you use? They're not called cat's paws. Maybe it's some Pennsylvania Dutch thing. You talk about the thrashing of the... What is the tree that you like that thrashes? When the wind's blowing?
Oh, oak leaves inside.
Oak leaves, oh yeah, so we call them cat's paws up here. When the wind is blowing on deciduous trees, the underside of the trees are lighter in color, and you can often see that on the ridge. They're kind of going from green to light green to green to back. That's the wind blowing on the trees. Anyway, I'm not going to beat this any further, but there's a whole lot of information you can get just by looking out the window. Okay. All right, now, so that was kind of theory, right? A nicely shaped ridge, perfect winds, everything is good. There's a lot of ways that things can start to go downhill, right? Now, at the macro level, let me start, and this is really Richard's presentation. You noticed in his charts that the winds often change over the course of the day. That your record flight, the winds were definitely decreasing over the course of the day, and the angle was changing as you, especially when you start doing long flights, you might actually be flying off the end of the system, right? So I'm assuming that you guys have gathered that from what he was talking about. What I'm talking about is even if the winds and everything are still working, some of the ridges that we fly on aren't exactly ideal. So, flat tops. A lot of the times, some of the ridges are very rounded and very broad at the top. And when that happens, it's really hard to find what I would call the local crest, right? It's kind of this broad area, and if you think about the diagram I showed you earlier, the wind is no longer kind of zooming up. It's kind of coming up at an angle, so there's much less vertical component. Now on top of it, it may be that the ridge is low, and when you get in that situation, the smart thing to do is to slow up, right? Find some thermal lift, and give yourself a little bit of a cushion. Now, that's counterintuitive, and it's actually not a great situation because you're now flying actually out of the best ridge lift. But the problem is, if it's going to be weak anyway, again, where you don't want to be is low and slow. So we fly a section here near a town called Snyder's, where the ridge is poorly formed, it's low and broken, and the strategy there is to tank up a little bit of altitude before you get to that bad stretch. Best case, if there's a thermal, you might not circle. You just waft out into it, get to 2,500, 3,000 feet, and now you can safely glide across that bad area. So.
And along those lines, I think it's also just another thing to add is that there's a lot of energy from the thermals, right? And the thermals they don't work that well that low. So if you're bouncing along the thermals, there's actually sometimes more energy bouncing up high than there is being down in the trees.
Yeah. You heard Carl mention someplace called the infamous Knobblies down past Cumberland. Same kind of a thing, broken low ridges. You can fly individual spurs, but you know, you're much happier to be able to get high. Best case, get up and wave. But the point is, you've got to recognize if you're flying from a really nice ridge to a lousy ridge, and what was working before, flying along at 100 knots, like I said earlier, it was 90, then 80, then 70. Something's getting worse, and it's time to do something about it before the next number is 60. Because once you're at 60 on a ridge, you are not a happy camper. And again, I'm talking mostly about, I'd say, a 35 to 1 or so glass ship. 126s are a whole special category. Just adjust the numbers downward a little bit from what I've been talking about, but the same concept. Okay, double ridges. Carl showed a picture of Jack's Mountain, and I think he covered this earlier. Some of our ridges aren't one peak; they're sort of joined with a little valley in the middle, or in some cases they're two ridges really, really close together with a tiny little valley. Whatever that picture is, you've kind of got two choices. You want to be high on the upper slope or low on the lower slope, moving along at a good clip. Where you don't want to get stuck is slow and low in the saddle, because especially if this step is broad here, all you need is a little bit of sink, a little bit of turbulence, and you're low and slow. You may not have the energy to hang a left and glide out to the front edge. You may end up settling in here. And at least one of the accidents on that list up front was exactly that kind of situation. So, and again, by the way, I've given examples here. There's probably dozens and dozens of them. I'm a little bit biased to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, because most of the flights we do get out to there. We are starting from where Carl is, where he's getting all the way down to Tennessee. And the ridge is a little bit different, but these are representative examples. And you guys, you're all going to get these presentations. You can all look them up. So one problem I've noticed, unfortunately, this projector is dark, and I kind of counted on these pictures, but I think it's intuitive. There's two ridges here. It's really hard to see the second one, but this is Dickey's Mountain and Mount Tango Mountain, past a place called McConnellsburg. This is heading down to the Potomac River. This is a very common turn point at Mifflin and Fairfield. And if you could see it, here's the ridge that you're flying. It's a higher ridge. There's a lower ridge in front. Just imagine when you're getting in here, right? The wind is coming from this side. Yeah, it's not going to be bright enough. I don't know if there's any other way I can do it.
It's better.
Okay. But the wind is coming along here. It's hitting this ridge, and it's creating turbulence in here. And I heard John Seymour, who is a man of very few words. One of his most effusive transmissions ever was a couple years ago going into here, and it involved no expletives because he's a well-trained military pilot. But it was for John, it was a mouthful. It's something to the effect of, "I think I just lost my fillings," or something like that. So it's very important that you pay attention to what's upwind of the ridge that you're flying on. And normal rule of thumb is in most situations you want to be flying on the upwindmost ridge. Now the problem is, again, there's no absolutes, right? Some places, the back ridge is high enough that you're above the turbulence that the front ridge is creating, and this is where experience comes in, and it's also where studying comes in. If you go to the OLC, and David's here in the room, David's just flown, I think you've probably flown the most miles on the ridge of a lot of pilots in the last year or two, and you download some of David's flights or some of our flights from here, you see how people are flying, and that tool is incredibly valuable to fly these flights back, because if you followed my rule of thumb, you probably would want to jump up to this ridge and finish up here. It just turns out that this valley is just wide enough and this is just high enough that you can kind of nip this and escape, but it won't work all the time. And that's the problem with ridge soaring. If the wind angle is bad, I would say if the wind angle is this way a little bit more, you're going to get buffered more, and you're fighting the headwind and you're sinking lower and lower on this ridge, you could get in real trouble real fast. So you got to have that sight picture as you're flying. See, again, every minute or two, you're making a macro judgment about how things are going. You can go along for hours and hours on good ridge, and it's just the easiest flying in the world. But you get to something like this, and you've got to be making judgments every few, minute is not even enough, every few seconds, whether you're going to be able to get in here and get out. And if you have any doubt, climb up, slow up, take a thermal turn or two if you want, or just say, hey, I'm not going to do this, and turn around. So that's converging. Low. There's a lot of low ridges out there, and some of them are beautiful. We fly a mountain called Montango Mountain, which is only about, 600 feet above the valley?
At best.
What's that?
At best.
At best. And in some areas it's 450, 500 feet. So you're at pattern altitude the whole way. There's not a lot of time. But as long as the winds are blowing and you've been going along at 100 knots, it's just another ridge. The problem is when you're on a low ridge and you've got a bad wind angle, or the winds are slacking down, or something else has happened, you've got literally seconds before you may have to make a decision that you're going to be landing in one of these fields. Now the good news at Woodward is there are fields. The bad news is a lot of these fields, especially as you get up here, they get smaller and very hilly and rolling. So you're going to be making an emergency landing. So, point being, if it's a low ridge, again, what I do, I just slow up a little bit. There's usually a lot of thermals, bounce a couple thermals. You'd be amazed in a modern glider, if you hit a 6-knot thermal and you do what Chip Garner called the whifferdills, you kind of whiff and you sniff, and you can gain 500, 600 feet without doing a 360. And now you've got that much more search range and you've got time. So, again, it's just situational awareness. Now, I did mention gadgets, but again, I don't know if any of you, how many of you know what a Netto is and have flown with Netto? Yeah. So Netto, it's actually less than a third. So Netto is a approach to variometry that tries to take out the glider sink rate and give you true air mass. So if the Netto says 3 knots, it thinks that the air is coming up at 3 knots. Okay, that's what Netto is trying to do. My rule of thumb is if I see less than 3 knots on a ridge day, I'm starting to get into weaker territory, and if I see 1 knot, now I'm really in very weak lift, right? So again, I'm not saying rely on your instruments, your eyeballs are fine, but if you have Netto and you know how to use it, that's a good check to see if that low ridge is still working well. Okay, have I lost anybody yet? We're almost there. All right. Offsets. Again, this is super dark, but almost every stretch of ridge that we fly, at some point, the continuity of the ridge gets broken. And Jonathan's going to talk at length about this, so I'm not going to go in depth, but there's gaps, which is the ridge is basically a straight line. It's just, there's a gap. Typically a river came through it, carved out a bunch of stone, and now you've got a quarter-mile, half-mile, 2-mile, 5-mile gap. Even more than that, there's lots of places where the ridge isn't continuous. There's a little offset. We call them offsets or whatever. And those offsets sometimes are actually really tricky, right? Because it's not enough that it doesn't feel like it's enough to stop and turn. But if you're not careful and you're not carrying enough energy, you can find yourself in a really bad spot really quickly where you can't get out. So let me kind of walk you guys through this. So this is actually Tussey near Altoona, Blair. You're coming from the north. There's a ridge here, and there's kind of a zig and a zag right here. Okay? And what's interesting about it is how easy this is to navigate depends on the wind angle and the wind strength, as well as the fact that there's an offset there, right? So if the wind is more northwesterly, let's say 310, 320, okay? When you come to here and you pull up, when you get to this point, the ridge is already going to be working because it's got a reasonably decent angle on it, and you should be able to hit ridge lift earlier. If you've got a very a westerly component, let's say this is 280, 270, now you're flying directly into a headwind for a long time, and if you think about it right here, the ridge, the wind is going to have a chance to kind of curl around the back side of this, kind of go around the end, do an end around, instead of all of it getting funneled over the top. So this whole area in here might be soft. So instead of just having to fly from point here to point here and off you go, you might have to fly from here all the way out to here, all along in a larger headwind component. Okay? This is one of thousands of examples, but the point is, while you're flying, every time you're coming to a discontinuity, your mind has got to be saying, okay, what's going to happen to me when I make that transition, right? Am I going to have a headwind component? Am I going to have a slight tailwind component? Am I going to be flying into a really, and again, if the worst case here would be a really strong speed with a bad direction vector, right? In other words, if you're flying into this, it's 30 knots, but it's bad direction. This whole section here could be bad, and now I'm flying into a really strong headwind and got to go a long ways before I hit something good. Whereas if it's this way, I've got a better shot of a quick zoop, and off I go.
What's the approximate distance on that?
Oh, it's a, I don't know, quarter mile?
Okay.
Half mile?
No,
It's less than a mile.
less than a mile. But
Way less than a mile. I mean, it's the kind of thing in a modern glass glider, if you were doing 110 knots here, it's just a momentary, maybe a cruise climb. You're not even going to pull up. You're just going to kind of bleed off a little speed, and by the time you get back here, you'll still be doing 85, 90. So, yeah. I mean, these gliders that we fly, and that's why we're talking about water. If your first flight is dry, that jump is going to be harder than if you're wet. The problem is, we talked about earlier, if you're flying heavy, now you've got other problems. So this is always a trade-off, right? If you're at 10 pounds in an ASG 29 and you're like my glider, you didn't even notice this. This just went by. If you're doing that in a 126, you're paying attention. Okay? All right. Now, I want to spend a couple seconds on this, well, no, a couple minutes on this. And this is a diagram of what Carl was talking about earlier. But if you saw that chart I put up at the beginning, about 60% or more of the fatal and serious accidents that happened on the ridge have happened at something like this. So let's spend a minute on it. So let's just say I'm coming along, I'm trying to go this way. This is the top of the ridge. Everybody got, this is a top view looking down at the crest of a local ridge. And I've decided for whatever reason that I have to climb off. Maybe this is the end of the ridge, and I've got to go upwind to get over here, right? So here I am flying along, and I hit a bump. What Carl was saying, and Richard was saying, and I'm reinforcing, is, so we're heading, this is us, we're heading that way. We hit a bump. Oh, great. First rule of thumb, we always turn away from the ridge, right? Even up high. If you notice, you can always tell when you're flying thermal flights with a ridge pilot, they always turn upwind, even at 5,000 feet. They're just conditioned to turn that way, right? So we're going to make an upwind turn, and then, as Carl said, first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of this. And Carl's point was, oftentimes thermals street up in front of the ridge, and most of the time the best thermals, a thermal that's really worth having the name thermal, maybe even a quarter mile or a half mile out front. So as long as I can keep going upwind and getting distance from the ridge crest, I'm gaining altitude over the local terrain, right? As soon as I'm at the end of that, I'm going to make that first turn. If I'm still low, and I'll talk about low in a second, all I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick figure 8. Now I'm going to reverse to the right, to the left, I'm sorry. And I'm going to keep doing that, figure 8s, hopefully moving further and further out, and sometimes leveling out into the wind, okay, until I've got a reasonable, significant amount of height over the ridge, right? If you were at the home airport and you were on base and you started doing 360s around the time you're middle of base leg, right? Everybody in the airport would come over and beat the living crap out of you. But yet, if you're over the crest of a ridge, you're doing exactly that. If you're doing 360s over the crest of a ridge, especially if the wind is blowing 30 knots while you're doing it, right? And that's what's gotten more than anything else, that's what's gotten guys killed or hurt, is not understanding this basic concept. So we'll spend some time on it. So we've done 3, 4, 5 figure eights. Sometimes you're stuck. The thermal may not be there, and you've only gained 300 feet, and it's gone. Well, don't start doing 360s, right? That one died. Fly up and down. And again, if this is the end of the road, right? There's no sense in going off the end of the road. You may fly along this section back and forth, and you'll see these all the time. You know, you're stuck on a ridge. Well, at least you've got the wind blowing. Just keep beating up and back and forth on that ridge until you get something that you can climb in. So you're going to dog bone or figure eight. Now, again, there's no bright line. This is a beginner class, so I'm saying 500 feet. That's probably enough, but that may not be enough. But you know, the books kind of say 200, 300. In my view, if you haven't been flying ridges for a while and you're not really, really proficient, I would dog bone or fly straight upwind until you've got a good solid 500 feet above the local ridge crest before you transition to doing full thermal 360s. Okay? Now, again, if you're super proficient and you're really good, then maybe a little bit lower, but certainly not ridge crest, because two things are going to happen. First off, these thermals can be very broken, very turbulent, and it's very easy to have one go away on you and have you start a spin. And the other thing is, if you end up downwind to this ridge and you're not climbing well, you may not be able to get back upwind. So when you're doing 360s, if you're not getting at least 2 knots, 3 knots of climb, and maybe more if the wind is strong, you're going to very quickly find yourself somewhere down here, and if you lose that thermal, you may not actually be able to get back over the ridge crest. So this kind of decision here and this transition here is really, really important. Yeah, I saw a hand up. Cookie.
The dog bone at higher altitudes. I find that people, you know, my students or whatever, aren't very good at dog boning. It's
Right.
not that easy of a maneuver
No.
to reverse and reverse
Yep.
and reverse. So I practice it
Absolutely.
at high altitudes where it's not a problem.
Spot on.
The other thing I want to point out is your thermal that took you across the crest.
Yep.
I get people all the time say to me, I say, well, what are you doing back there? Oh, well, I'm thermaling.
Right.
To me, there's no advantage to crest.
Yep.
Crest. I go upwind and find an upwind thermal
Yep.
and drift back to the crest. Because if you get caught back there,
Yep.
it's usually a one-way trip.
I mean, by here, if you're here and you're not almost 1,000 feet above the ridge crest already, you're in trouble.
But you're going to blow to 1,000 feet getting back there.
Right.
So it's not really that
Yep.
advantageous
Yes.
to thermal behind a ridge.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are stories, you know, and again, this is why situational awareness is so big. There are stories of people who kind of get confused, and they leave a thermal like this, and they start flying down the wrong side of the ridge. No, I mean, it's happened. In fact, a guy wrecked a 27 down at Newcastle doing that. Because you've been spending all this time doing other stuff, and you're sort of a little foggy on what's going on. So, yeah, I mean, you know, generally speaking, your playground is in front of the ridge, and behind the ridge is saved for when you're really up high or you're coming after making a transition. It's not where you want to be spending time. The other problem is, oftentimes what happens is even in a thermal, you'll hit this incredible pulse back here, and you think, oh man, that's it, it's 6 knots. Remember that eddy picture that I showed you? Sometimes it's just really violent turbulence, and next thing you know, you're coming out of the sky like a set of car keys. So,
So, Eric, one
yes,
thing, that thermal sort of looks like it's a little bit of a northerly wind.
sure.
In my unskilled observation, it seems like when the wind is blowing at an angle, the thermals are elongated and you're close to the ridge.
Maybe,
Which
yeah.
makes the figure eight, you know, work better.
Yeah, yeah. John's point was that the thermal may not be the classic column. Sometimes it can be like and Richard showed these thermals that are stretching out a little bit. So sometimes dog boning or even just flying straight upwind is really better than circling. plus of course your sink rate in straight flight is much less than 45 degrees bank. So if it's weak or broken, sometimes all you can do is just kind of keep poking upwind, and when you lose it, kind of come around. You know, I mean, it's extreme challenging flying, which is why the best thing you can do is pick a day that the winds aren't super strong, because that at least makes this process that much easier. If it's 35 knots at Ridgecrest and you're doing what I'm talking about, you're working hard. You're working hard, exactly. Bobby.
I find when I'm mentoring people that are pretty new on the ridge, doing these figure eight things, they tend to skid their turns pretty badly,
Yeah.
which is a no-no.
Yes.
And I've seen it a lot, and then, or they'll speed up a lot too.
Right.
They're afraid to go slow, come up the ridge, so they speed it up and skid their turn, and it's just bad
Yeah.
technique. And you get plenty of time, if you fly the local ridge in ridge conditions, to practice that maneuver till you've got it down perfect.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think Bobby makes a great point, is the straight part of ridge soaring is really, about as easy as it can get. We had Carl hosted the Nationals a couple years ago, the sports class Nationals, and we had I think we had 4 backside or 3 backside and 1 front side. We called it the no-turn Nationals. We had, I think the first 3 days, Boris Kubrak literally never flew a single 360. He just went up, down. I think we had 1 transition where we blew downwind and we came home, right? You know, that doesn't happen very often when you're trying to do a big flight. Most of the time, there's at least a couple times during the flight where you've got to make a tricky transition, and that ability to fly steeply banked, very, very coordinated, and also reasonably, high-speed 360 is important. So Bobby's point about speeding up, there's no single number, because as Richard showed, there's a wide range of stall speeds with wing loadings, but in my glider, on a really strong ridge day, if I'm flying less than about 60 at that first couple of turns, I'm probably too slow. And it's hard to make a 360 tight enough to climb, which is all the more reason why a little bit of that wafting and dog boning is important until I'm high enough where I can afford to slow up a little bit. And by then, normally the thermal's gotten organized anyway. It's really, the scariest part for me is those climbs out of the gullies or the down low stuff. Where's Rick Healy? Rick and I were flying my Grove years ago. Oh, just give the pad a quick touch. And we had a, no, that was the thingy, I think. Yeah, that's it. We were flying along, and he was flying, and I normally my voice doesn't go up 6 octaves. But we're flying along, and all of a sudden we did a 180. And I remember I screamed, "What are you doing?"
Uncommanded.
We hit a gully, and we just had a wing on the Grove just literally dropped out of the sky, and luckily we pivoted away from the ridge, and next thing we know, we're headed back southwest. And Rick said, "I didn't do anything." Okay. So it's a really, it's a very challenging, and again, if you took nothing else away from today, this is the dangerous, really dangerous part. And like Bobby said, practice this on the local ridge, practice this with an instructor, and get good at this stuff, because everything else is relatively easier. Yeah.
So, because the dog bone is apparently a fairly difficult,
Figure eight,
maneuver. Yeah. What kind of bank are you looking at? Because if you're going 60, minimum 70.
Yeah, as much as you. I mean, the real answer is as much as it takes to stay in the lift. I don't know, 45, 50 degrees.
The bank is continually variable.
Right. It's
When
really
When you're into the wind, you're no bank.
Yep.
And as you're cutting back toward the ridge and coming out
Yep.
of that, it's fairly
Yeah.
steep.
If you ever took, do you ever do like power flying, you do chandelles or turns about a point or whatever? Well, there's a reason that these kind of, because what you're trying to do is keep the glider out in front of the ridge, so the bank angle as you're heading into the wind could be almost 0. In fact, it oftentimes is 0. And the bank angle when you're on the reversing course part before you come the other way could be 60 degrees. It's a very complex, yeah, David.
I would add about when you're circling, when you get to a safe altitude and circle, the variable bank angles also apply. Even in your normal circle, you're going to straighten it out into the wind and you're going to honk it really hard at the downwind side of the curve.
Yeah, what I call it is position holding thermally as opposed to wind
Drifting
drift
thermally. Yep.
So yeah, that's important.
When I closed the ridge, I stumbled into all this stuff. So everyone said experience, I was standing up late, but it's luck. And what I found in that situation try to practice any.
One of the
road
challenges is I'm picking on Carl a little bit, but I've listened to Carl a few times, and asking Carl to explain what he does, he says, well, I just do it. And actually, sometimes with those thermals, remember I said ass and eyeballs earlier? You'll feel the G-loading and the thermal getting better as you're going into it. Well, okay, great. And you'll feel it start to fall away probably before the vario will react. Better start turning now, because if you're waiting for the vario to tell you to climb, you've already missed it, cookie.
Occasionally I get students that they learn the dog bone, they do perfect dog bones.
Right.
Then I say, now do it in the thermal.
Right. Yeah.
Eric, I think as you drift back, once you start the circles, the rule of thumb that I've always found to be very useful is that if you can't see down the front slope, the slope that you're soaring, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
So
That's
lose sight
from
of
a hang glider pilot, and that's a very good rule of thumb.
Yeah, as soon as you lose sight of the front slope,
You're already in trouble.
you're already in trouble.
Yeah.
So
So Daniel, how am I doing on time?
I'll make the last comment, then we got to move on, I think.
Okay.
So,
I
but
want
if
to
you
show
go back,
one more picture.
if you're gonna actually go back one, I just want to make a point that I think is worth adding here, which is that the lift, on the front side. So basically, on a decent day, the good air is going to be going up on the front side of the ridge, and that once you're over the middle, unless you're on a thermal, the air is neutral or bad, right? So, but if you're in front, even if you're 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 feet above the ridge, I mean, even at 2,000 feet, you might be getting just a little tiny bit of ridge lift, and that's good for the thermals.
Yeah.
So basically, any ridge pilot, when you go back to the other diagram, that you're the second to last, when you're in front of the ridge, you're happy, and you're thermaling, you're happy. If you're flying the ridge, you're happy. If you're over the middle of the ridge, you're very unhappy. It's if I have to be there. If it's like, no other possibility, then fine, I'll begrudgingly do it. But if I'm thermaling in front of the ridge, very happy. So, and that's usually where the better air is. That's where the thermals are.
And if you guys have ever looked at Richard talked about the satellite loop. If you've ever looked, oftentimes you'll see these gorgeous pictures during the height of a big thermal day, and you'll see two things are happening. The thermals are lined up not only in streets, but they're lined up in front of the ridges, and that's either wave or ridge influence. But oftentimes when you're flying along, you'll see this. There's a line of Q that's a quarter mile, half mile, 1 mile in front of the ridge. Well, if you're high enough, that's the best place to be, because now you're out in front and you're getting thermals that are actually organized. If you're picking up a thermal that broke off the crest of the ridge, you're probably already in trouble because you're too far back. Yeah, I get.
Just a quick one. So Richard and I used to fly out of Kutztown, when there was a ridge there, right? And we had to get to the ridge flying through the lee,
Right.
or to the back of the ridge. So you might want, and this is not an unusual situation when you have to transition, right?
So there's a whole session on transitions coming up.
very good.
Yep, we're going to cover all that, I think. Jonathan? Where's Jonathan? You're going to cover that?
What was that?
Transitioning from the back to get over a ridge and all that fun stuff? Transitions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think, Daniel, I'm not probably going to do the KML file thing.
Yeah.
But I'm just reinforcing a picture that Richard showed earlier. But just reinforcing, this is just another view of the same thing. But here we are. We're right, actually Panther Valley is kind of right here. This is kind of our local ridge. I just wanted to point out again something that Richard pointed out, Carl pointed out, and I'm going to re-point it out. Even our stretch of ridge has a couple little it's got these little S-turns here and there. But a good prevailing wind of about 330 is wonderful for our ridge. There's a section here where Tuscarora and Bear and what's this, Peters up here, 340 even up to Williamsport. Williamsport is up here. It works very northerly, and then pretty quickly again it goes back to 330, 300, 280. So on average, for most of the people here, and I apologize for the Tennessee and Alabama folks because you guys are down here in off my map. But you guys just should be working with whoever your local mentors are to figure out what's the ideal kind of average wind for your area when you're doing your 500 or your 1,000. If you're flying out of Blairstown and you've got a forecast of anything from about 310 to 340, and you're doing your first 500 down to here, here we go, sorry, down to here and back, 330, 340, you're happy. If you're flying from Carl's Place or Mifflin or ridge soaring and you're maybe doing Cumberland, you know, you're happy with probably what, 300, Carl?
370.
Yeah, but I'm saying like your best day, the best day for your average flight out of Eagle Field, not a long, a touring mission. 310, 300. So 30 degrees difference, right? The problem is if you're hearing 310 forecast at Blairstown and there's any chance it's going to back to 290, that's pretty marginal. So pick a day when the direction and the speeds match to the area that you're planning your first long ridge mission. Don't push the boundaries. All right? Last thing, can I just have 1 minute?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, how many of you fly for the airlines here? Where's Alan and some of the other folks? Okay, right. So one of the things that you guys have that glider pilots don't have is you have a manual that your chief pilot put together that said what you can and can't do in certain conditions, right? Max crosswinds, stabilized approaches, all that other good stuff. Glider pilots are notorious cheaters, right? You say I'm going to do this stuff, and then you do something, you say, well, you know, I said my limits are X, and I'm going to do, well, you know, Carl did it, so I can do it. So what I strongly recommend all of you do that are seriously thinking about ridge soaring is create your own personal chart. It doesn't have to be 50 items. In fact, a few is good. But I'm going to tell you mine. I've been flying ridges for almost 30 years. What, 25 years. And when I was 28, 30, 35, I did a lot of this. And I'm sure Carl did a lot of this too. Greg Leslie told me one time in the L-19, right after it had...
Can't read the...
I'll give you the basics, but Greg Leslie told me one time, right after the L-19 had a rebuild, and somewhere about 800 feet, it started to swallow a valve. And he held on, thank God it was Greg, because he knew what he was doing. He held me on until I had about 1,000 feet on a day like this. Now, we're not over the ridge. I was too scared to land, so the only thing I could do was hang on in rotor and thermals for about an hour until I got high enough to make it over to the front side of the ridge, where I proceeded to spend 6 hours basically flying locally because I literally couldn't land the airplane, okay? You don't want to be that person. So what I would suggest is there's a couple things, right? What are the ridgetop winds that you want to see, right? What are the surface gusts that you're capable of handling at your level of experience? And if you're doing a longer flight, what are your limits for clouds and visibility? Now, there's tons of other things, but if you wrote those down and you stick to them, and the guys on my club will know, I have said numerous times nowadays, I'm passing on Monday. Okay? I've gotten on and said, I'm not flying. Even though we've got a tow plane and some of the guys want to go fly, I've kind of ruled this out. So my personal limits are, you know, gusting to 30, maybe 35 or whatever, but if I see TAFs above 30 on the forecast, okay, I'm sitting this one out. If I see ridgetop winds 20 to 30, I'm fine. If I see ridgetop winds at 35, I'm sitting this one out. And if I don't have at least 1,500, which is about a 4,000-foot cloud base for long flights, I'm not going to try to make super long flights. I'll fly ridge, but I may not try to say this is the 1,000K or the 1,200K day. If you're getting started, I would strongly recommend you pick something like 20 knots, 15 to 20 on ridgetop, and a solid 2,000 foot or something like this. But when you do your first flight, okay, write this down ahead of time so you don't cheat, and stick to it. And then once you've got a couple 500s and you've done, you know, 100 hours on the ridge, you can move up to experienced. The worst thing you can do is try to make your first big ridge flight on an expert day. You're going to scare yourself silly and you may end up killing yourself. So, that's it.